dreadful for our final session of the day before we sum up and leave you all to network. And quite rightly, I think we're handing over to the next generation who, after all, will be impacted by the climate and nature emergencies far more than we will, simply because they're going to live through them longer. Bruce Adamson is the Children and Young Persons Commissioner for Scotland. In this role, he promotes and protects the rights of children and young people. This is an interest that Bruce has held throughout his entire career. For 20 years, he has worked as a lawyer on children's rights issues and human rights as well. Here, Bruce is in conversation with two of the advisors to his role as the Children and Young People's Commissioner. They are 16-year-old Mccail from the Borders. Coll is passionate about social and climate justice. And Beccie White, who is also 16. She's campaigned on climate change and gender equality, and she works with CYPCS to ensure that every child knows their rights and has their rights protected. It's over to you, Bruce, Coll and Beccie.
Hi, I'm Bruce. I'm the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland. And with me today, I've got Coll and Beccie, who are two of the young advisors to my office. And this really important discussion we're having about human rights, and particularly recognising the role that young people are playing as leaders in the movement for climate justice. And Coll and Beccie are two amazing human rights defenders, and so they're going to be doing most of the talking. So I'd like to start by asking you both, is climate change a human rights issue?
I'll go. I think primarily the reason I think it's a human rights issue is because I think climate change is a class issue, and because it's a class issue, it doesn't affect everybody equally, and therefore is a human rights issue. Primarily because of the ability to get involved with the climate movement, is it a class issue? I think that if you don't have the time on your hands, if you can't afford to live economically and in an environmental way, you are cut off. You don't have the time to engage in strikes. You can't do that kind of thing, and we have to combat the kind of exclusion which can happen in that regard. And in that way, climate change is most definitely a class issue, but it's also a class issue because, I mean, if you don't have enough money to get through the week, you don't have the time to think about the melting of the polar ice caps. And then in terms of who it affects, I mean, the global south are going to be the first victims of the climate crisis, despite the fact that it's the global north who have been solely responsible almost for the crisis. We've been plundering southern oil reserves for years, and yet now that these global countries in the global south have the ability to use their oil reserves, we're telling them no and taxing it incredibly so they can't use it. And in that regard, climate change is most definitely a human rights issue.
And Beccie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're going to see in recent and like the years coming that climate change is going to impact people's right to housing. We've seen recently a lot of extreme weather, so we're going to see extreme flooding and increased frequency of natural disasters, which will impact that. And if we look a bit more closer to home, we see that climate change and your right to education are linked. Currently we do not have adequate climate education, so young people aren't able to access their right to education to its fullest extent because they're not learning about the climate crisis, despite the fact it's going to undoubtedly impact their future.
Absolutely, and I think that's hugely important in terms of setting climate change as a human rights issue, and all the work that you've been doing on climate justice and the links between climate change and the right to life and development, cutting through absolutely every aspect of our life and that disproportionate impact that it's having on different parts of the world and different people. Hugely important. So how important is your generation then in the fight for climate justice, Beccie?
I think, previous generations have wasted years and years and years with inaction. So I think it really does fall to our generation to stop the inaction and actually take notice and pull up. However, I think what's important to note is that a lot of this generational, the fact it's been left to our generation is unfair, because it's not actually our generation that's caused this massive issue. And a lot of the time it feels like we've just been handed this massive burden of climate change and we've been told to fix it. And yet when young people do, like for example Greta Thunberg, when young people do go to the people in power and say we need to change something, they're not given then the influence or the power to actually make the change they need to make. So it feels that sometimes it's like, you want us to change this, but yet you're not giving us the influence in order to do so.
Yeah. And Col?
What Becky says is absolutely spot on, and I think that because it falls to our generation to deal with climate change, there's a stigma attached to it, and there is this kind of immense pressure on younger people that young people can no longer be seen to buy kind of aluminium cans of Iron Brew or plastic bottles of Fanta, and you're constantly kind of trying to live your life by like avoiding the looks you get for buying plastic bottles in the co-op, and that puts an immense pressure on us because there's this stigma, and it is our responsibility, but at the same time it's like we need to break down the fact that you're not causing climate change by buying your water bottle. It's like so much has happened before us. We have to remember that when we're kind of living with the pressure upon our shoulders, is the word, to solve the climate crisis. So I think that it's so important that you get involved with the climate movement, despite the fact that you can buy your plastic bottle.
It's hugely important in terms of, again, one of the frustrating things that I think we sometimes hear is that children and young people are the future or leaders of the future, when in fact you're playing a leadership role right now, and you're full rights holders right now. And where you need to be is in the places where decisions are made. And so not the individual actions that you're taking, but rather being right at the heart of the decision making about the systemic changes that are needed. I think that's hugely powerful. And so what would you say then to the adults who are saying that young people are climate alarmists or making too much of a big deal, or that it's about individual responsibility?
I'd say that firstly, we're most definitely not climate alarmists, but I'd acknowledge that the holding up of banners that say we've got 5 years left on the planet doesn't help. That doesn't help. But at the same time, in the next few years, climate change is going to become a key proponent in everything we do. I mean, talk about a Green New Deal, that's going to affect housing, it's going to affect, as Becky said, it's going to affect so many things. It's going to affect education, building a kind of school programme which involves climate change. When we're building kind of infrastructure and in every part of public policy, climate change is going to play such a huge role, as it should. And to accuse anyone of being alarmist when climate is going to play the role that it hopefully will, that doesn't make sense, because as the years go by, climate change is going to affect every corner of young people's lives and everybody's life. So it's not alarmist to raise the issue in the slightest.
Becky?
I think looking at it from like an individual responsibility, I think like as Cole said, like it is, this rhetoric we hear a lot about around climate change is that it's all the individual responsibility, and like you should buy a bamboo trick brush and you should make sure you recycle everything, which I think you should be doing, and I hope you do. However, I think it's a fantastic rhetoric to peddle when the government has been not doing things and when large corporations are still emitting tons and tons of emissions that are harming the planet. So I think as much as we do need to make our own individual choices, I think we need to look to the root cause of it. And I think, it's not, we shouldn't just like think that things are going to change if the market demands it. We should say it's the government responsibility to put in regulations in place to make sure it changes. And I think that we really need to make sure we get long-standing, systemic, sustainable change instead of just relying on the good nature of people, which is also sometimes, as Cole was saying, it's also a class issue. We can't rely on, people cannot afford all these sustainable products. So we need to do something in place to change it so that all products are sustainable.
Can I come in on that just quickly, Bruce? It's just
absolutely, yeah.
Becky's totally right. And the very nature of our economic model just now is expansionary, where capitalism ever expands and it's ever growing. And by that nature, it's, despite however many strikes we go on, the complete commercialisation to the detriment of the climate will continue at an ever-growing pace. And whilst the climate industry will be commoditised and kind of the system will lend a hand in battling climate change in solar panels and in wind farms, there will never ever be an alternative in which climate is put at the top of the agenda because of the very nature of global economics at the moment, because global economics in itself relies on the principle of competition, which is so far apart, competition is, from being kind of green and from being fair on climate change. The two are completely contradictory. I think that's so important to note when you're considering the kind of key impact of climate change and causes.
Yeah, just to come in on that, I think like we look at something even like, for example, a phone, like the entire kind of idea around that is that a new one comes out every 2 or so years, which is pretty much identical, maybe a few new features, and people will buy it and get rid of their perfectly usable old phone, or in fact actually slowing down phones. And I think just acknowledging that like the entire system is what's part of the issue, I think is really important.
Absolutely, and I think this links really strongly to the global obligation. So it's not an individual, but it's not even any one government that is going to be the solution to this, but the global community working together. And so we have started to see movement in terms of international law focusing on climate, addressing climate change, and starting to bring in mechanisms for climate justice. And obviously, a big opportunity later this year, if COVID allows for it to happen, of COP26 and some of those discussions. How do you feel that the international community is doing in terms of taking this seriously and addressing the concerns that you've raised?
I think a lot of human rights bodies like the UN have been really good at recently looking at the human rights-based approach that we can take to tackling climate change and the acknowledgement that it will impact on human rights. I think also, incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child will hopefully happen for Scots law in 2021. So I think once that is in place, it will be interesting to see how that kind of plays out in terms of if it means that we can take more stricter climate policies in a direct correlation to the right to life and the right to a safe environment.
Yeah.
Totally, and I think also that currently climate is fashionable, which means that it's a vote winner. And for as long as climate stays fashionable, there will be international efforts because it's popular, and that's a good thing. But what we have to ensure is that it doesn't become, as so many other issues have, like trans rights, for example. Climate might become the next victim of this. People call it a culture war, to the point if we allow climate to be deemed woke in the same way that other kind of issues like it have been and continue to be, we are in a really dangerous territory where it becomes this polarizing issue where you have kind of reactionaries and progressives on either side of a divide, and rather than uniting young people, climate is this polarized issue which is used to kind of both gain votes and throw them away. And we have to prevent climate from becoming another kind of culture war target, if you like, I think.
Absolutely. I think what you both said there is incredibly powerful in terms of the need to build this within legal systems and mechanisms and understand that this is a universal issue that affects everybody, and shouldn't be subject to the vagaries of politics or popularity, but seen as a fundamental human rights issue. I think that's really powerful from both of you. And so what advice would you then give to other young people who want to join the fight for climate justice? What types of things should they be doing?
Become a young advisor. The Children and Young People's Commissioner's Office. You can apply now online, I believe, or via Twitter. As much as that's a plug, honestly, totally, you should. It's the most amazing opportunity to tackle not just climate change, but a whole range of human rights issues, both affecting children and young people and everyone, and to guide the most incredible office in the right direction. In addition to that, I don't know, Becky, what do you think?
I would say keep on reading, keep on getting, keep on just be aware of the climate crisis, and particularly try to look at it through a human rights angle, which sometimes it isn't looked at through. So I think just learn about your rights and then learn about the environment. And I think what's also important is making sure that you're kind of looking at other countries and what other countries are doing, because a lot of the time we like to think that our country will have the best solution, when actually we can learn a lot from other countries and other countries' approaches. So I'd recommend just reading around and doing as much as you can.
We've also got an election coming up. So, read parties' manifesto and read climate commitments and, I don't know, register to vote, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. For those that can vote, and thanks so much, Cole, for the plug for the office. Because I've got the best job in the world as Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland. But the best part of that job is working with children and young people, and particularly the role that young advisors like Beccie and Cole play in terms of advising me on every aspect of our work, and it's really powerful. And as you've seen from the discussion today, the insight that they can give really changes the way that I do my work. So I would encourage anyone who's in any position of decision making or power to think about how they can involve children and young people in their work, and particularly on some of these issues like climate justice, where young people have really been leading the way. We absolutely have to make sure that children and young people are at the heart of every place where decision is made in relation to business and human rights and climate justice. And so that's a hugely important thing that everyone can do, is think about how to involve children and young people in your decision making and work. And so, Beccie and Cole, have you got any kind of final calls to action or words of advice or challenges for those that have been involved in this conference about what adults should do differently? Any final words from either of you or both of you?
I think listen to young people and truly value their views. I think sometimes it's become almost like fashionable to involve young people, to the point where it becomes quite tokenistic, and like you can write a report and like the recommendations might not even be looked at. So I think what's really important is, if you are going to engage with young people, which you should be doing, make sure it's meaningful and make sure you actually are going to take on their ideas and value them. And I think that's especially important for younger people who actually can't vote. So decisions are being made without them taking part in it. Like major decisions are happening and they don't actually have a say. And I think it's also important to remember that like these decisions will impact us for the longest time. Like it is our future. So I think it's really unfair that sometimes it's our future and we're not even getting a say. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Beccie and Cole.
I think don't use young people as a tick box, as Beccie says, totally. And bear in mind that the impression you get about young people from the media and from from papers, TV and radio isn't always accurate at all. And that, I think totally that you should be involving young people in everything that you do, as Beccie said. And there is real potential there for kind of discussions and engagement, and in building up kind of involvement in current affairs amongst a generation who are already kind of going through a politicisation with climate and with Black Lives Matter over the summer. And these issues are engaging our generation, and it's the responsibility of organisations to build on that engagement by encouraging them into their work.
Well, a fantastic way to end from both of you. So thanks, Beccie. Thanks, Cole, for that fantastic discussion. And thanks all of you for watching and for being committed to this issue and seeing climate change as a human rights issue.
Thank you, Beccie, Cole and Bruce. I really, really enjoyed that. I thought it was terrific. And I wasn't alone. Shirley Matheson has been in touch with us through the comment section. So good to hear balanced comments from young contributors. Too often it's the end of the world young view that we are hammered with. Thank you to Harper McLeod for giving them this platform. Well, I think we need to say thank you, yes, to Harper McLeod for giving them this platform, but also thank you to them for taking the time to share their views. Really interesting stuff there. I don't know what you took from that most of all, David, but for me it was that we need to prevent climate from becoming a political issue that will polarize people, and realize that, I suppose, as we have done today, realize that it's a global human rights issue as well. And also, I think Beccie said to learn from other countries and other communities, which is exactly what we did just in that last session.